Well, thank you very much for being here. At today's cabinet meeting, I've just returned from a very historic trip to Europe where we've made incredible progress toward achieving greater peace, security, and prosperity for America, for our allies, and in fact for the entire world. The meetings with NATO, the United Kingdom, and with Russia were a tremendous success, and I think you will see that, and it'll play out over a period of years, frankly, but they were a tremendous success.
It's a show of force in a region rife with rivalry and tension. The U.S. Navy preparing allies to be at the ready in the Black Sea. Crucial, says Rear Admiral Sean Duane of the 6th Fleet.
I think Russian activity in the region has served to destabilize the security environment in Europe.
We're sailing off the coast on the U.S. guided missile destroyer Porter in an exercise with Ukrainian and Turkish frigates. While an angry Russia monitors every move, the Foreign Ministry calls the whole exercise a provocation. The Porter's skipper, Captain John Tobin, says 4 Russian Navy vessels are shadowing his operation.
Currently, we are 86 miles off of Sevastopol, as well as off the Crimean Peninsula.
It was just a year ago the Porter was buzzed by 2 low-flying Russian fighters right here in the Black Sea. Operation Seabreeze, as it's called, sees some 2,000 sailors and Marines training alongside one another, not only at sea. We are flown to a Ukrainian military base where joint exercises are taking place.
For 21 years, the United States and its allies in this very volatile region have come together to communicate and integrate, and this year is the most vital yet.
Tensions have reached a boiling point with daily exchanges of fire on Ukraine's eastern border with Russia. We are at war with the Russian Federation, says the Ukrainian Rear Admiral here. I want President Trump to tell Putin this is the 21st century and to stop the imperialism. Many nations accuse Putin of stirring up trouble in the Black Sea.
It's nobody's lake, and we're here to support that.
On the eve of Helsinki, America is showing the flag, assisting its allies in confronting an increasingly aggressive Russia.
Sometime this fall, we could see Vladimir Putin at the White House. What's on the agenda? Russia is concerned about American missile defense systems in Eastern Europe, placed there after NATO expanded into the region following the Cold War. The United States has missile defense systems in Poland, Romania, the Czech Republic. The U.S. claims these systems are part of deterrence from threats like Iran. Russia says the systems could neutralize Russia's nuclear capabilities and eliminate tenuous peace on the continent based on the principle of mutually assured destruction. But now the United States is concerned new Russian missile technology will be able to thwart missile defense systems. During the summit, President Putin also said the United States and Russia need to agree on extending the Strategic Offensive Arms Limitation Treaty and not to place weapons in outer space. For more on the chances for an agreement on ballistic weapons between the USA and Russia, here's former U.S. diplomat Jim Jatras. Welcome.
Thank you, Holland. Glad to be here.
How did we get to this point following the Cold War?
It's been a long time coming, unfortunately. I think there were a lot of people on our side that never really thought the Cold War was over, that after the Russians were assured that NATO would not extend 1 inch past Germany for political reasons, initially with Bill Clinton and the Polish vote in Illinois during the 1996 election. We had the first round of NATO expansion. There have been many other steps after that, including the cancellation of the ABM treaty. That's something that the Russians place a lot of stock on, and that's one reason we have these issues of these missile emplacements in Eastern Europe are such a big deal for them.
So is this Russian concern legitimate? Is it stimulus response? Is this what's driving their high-tech war machine?
Look, I honestly think it is. And of course, if you say that, then you're a Putin apologist, you're a Russian stooge and all that. Look, do you see people marching through the streets of Europe saying, America, defend us from Iranian missiles? You don't see that. When we put those missiles in Eastern Europe, in Romania and Poland, we had to twist arms. Not the Poles. The Poles wanted them, but the Romanians, other countries turned them down. It's not as though those countries are begging for this defense because they're worried about Iranian missiles. That raises the question of the Russians saying, wait a minute, those have nothing to do with Iran. Those are aimed at us.
Right. You know what else you don't see is a lot of mainstream media coverage of this. We're talking life and death. We're certainly talking about it here. Why is this not elsewhere?
Because I think part of it is that back during the first Cold War, a lot of that came from the left in the American political spectrum that was all for arms control, all for getting along with the Soviets, and for a lot of complex reasons that we can't really detail here tonight, they've sort of flipped. If you look at the polls, it's actually more conciliatory opinion on the right of the American political spectrum in the Republican Party than you now find on the left. Now, maybe a lot of that's just partisan because of Trump.
So, Vladimir Putin may come to visit in the fall. Are we going to see something akin to the Gipper and Gorby, or is the mood different now?
I think the mood's going to be different. Maybe they can call the guys in London and get a baby Putin balloon that they'll carry around in the demonstrations, because I expect there will be demonstrations against him. I don't know if this would just be a low-key meeting here, whether it would be a full state visit, you know, with Russian flags and American flags down Pennsylvania Avenue. It's going to get hairy, I think.
But Putin's regime has developed and fostered the most effective cyber army in the world, and he's used it to wreak havoc in the West. These hackers have stolen classified US information, hacked politicians' email accounts, even shut down Georgia's internet while Russian troops invaded, and of course, they tried to sabotage Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign in 2016. Russian hackers have also launched propaganda campaigns in support of right-wing candidates in Europe. With this, Putin hopes to exploit and deepen the political divide in Western democracies. The election of Donald Trump brings new hope for the Putin vision. Trump's rhetoric has been notably soft on Russia. He could lift sanctions and weaken NATO, potentially freeing up space for Putin's Russia to become a dominant power once again. Vladimir Putin has been ruling Russia since 1999. In that time, he shaped the country into an authoritarian and militaristic society. He successfully invaded two of Russia's neighbors and strengthened ties with Syria and Iran. He's intent on pushing back against the Western world order, and it appears to be working.
Putin, Vladimir Putin, 17 years of the most powerful man in the world.
To understand how one man could have such a powerful influence on this country, you need to go back to the chaos and corruption that gripped Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. When the Berlin Wall fell, a 40-year-old Putin was working as an undercover spy in East Germany for the Soviet security agency, the KGB. The Soviet Union dissolved into 15 new countries, including the new Russian Federation. In Putin's eyes, Russia had just lost 2 million square miles of territory. He later called this a major geopolitical disaster of the century, lamenting that tens of millions of his co-patriots found himself outside Russian territory. The new government had to sell off nearly 45,000 public businesses, like energy, mining, and communication companies that had been run by the communist regime, and it was chaos. The Russian economy was in a free fall, and all of these companies ended up in the hands of a few extremely wealthy men, known today as Russia's oligarchs. At the same time, the new Russian state was having a hard time establishing itself. Russia's first president, Boris Yeltsin, was wildly unpopular for cooperating with the West. And to make matters worse, he was an alcoholic, and many Russians thought he was an embarrassment. In order to stay in power, he leaned on the support of these oligarchs, surrendering an immense amount of political power to them. This graph shows how inequality actually worsened after the fall of the Soviet Union. This is where Vladimir Putin enters politics. He leaves the KGB in 1991 and becomes the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. Putin uses his position to give special treatment to friends and allies in the private sector. He helps them structure monopolies and regulates their competitors, quickly becoming a favorite among the oligarchs. Before long, he's assembled a support network of oligarchs, crime bosses, and security officials, mostly fellow former KGB officers like he was. With their help, he rapidly ascends to the upper echelons of the new Russian state. Patronage and corruption remain some of his key tools, but he quickly suppresses the oligarchs under his rule. Those that support Putin are rewarded, those that don't are eliminated.
Well, once Russia's richest man, imprisoned Kremlin critic and former oil magnate Mikhail Khodorkovsky was sentenced to 14 years in jail, this on a new conviction of embezzling oil.
This is effectively a vendetta from Vladimir Putin for Khodorkovsky getting involved in opposition politics.
In Russia, it is a dangerous profession to oppose the government in general and Vladimir Putin in particular. Let's have a look at some of the Russians who died under suspicious circumstances in the past 14 years. In 2004, journalist Anna Politkovskaya, a critic of Vladimir Putin, was poisoned, and evidence that could prove it was destroyed. She survived writing an article about the experience, but she was gunned down in the elevator of her Moscow apartment 2 years later. A month after that, former agent Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned in London by a radioactive substance in his tea. Litvinenko became a critic of the Russian government after leaving the KGB, which is the successor, or the KGB's successor, the FSB. In one of the most outrageous deaths, Oleg Zhukovsky was killed in 2007. The senior executive at the Russian bank VTB allegedly committed suicide by putting a bag over his head, tying himself to a chair, and throwing himself into his swimming pool. Zhukovsky opposed the Kremlin takeover of the bank he worked at. In 2009, human rights lawyer Stanislav Markelov and Anastasia Babarova were killed in Moscow, shot in broad daylight. Markelov is believed to have been the main target. He represented journalists who were critical of Putin and brought cases against members of the Russian military, among others, for human rights abuses. Human rights activist Natalia Estemirova was kidnapped in 2009, then shot on the side of the road. She was a frequent associate of two of the activists who I mentioned earlier. And then there's the Russian tax lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, who was arrested and died in custody in 2009. Severe beatings and mistreatment allegations are blamed for his death. Magnitsky allegedly found tax officials and police officers were bilking citizens out of millions of dollars. Authorities dropped the investigation into his death, but his name lives on in the U.S. Magnitsky Act, which severely sanctions nearly 4 dozen Russian officials and businessmen with connections to Vladimir Putin. Meanwhile, in Moscow, a top Putin critic and political rival, Boris Nemtsov, was gunned down within sight of the Kremlin in early 2015. Nemtsov was once seen as a successor to Boris Yeltsin, later documenting corruption and abuse of power in the Russian government.
I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward and trustworthy.
Since he first took office in 2000, Putin has kept a tight leash on Russian television. Essentially, all news outlets are state-owned propaganda machines. His regime decides which stories air and how, always depicting him as the strong Russian leader. Putin hopes to exploit and deepen the political divide in Western democracies. In 2014, the Putin vision culminated in the targeting of Ukraine, another former Soviet country. Ukraine's president was opening up to the West, and Putin feared he would join NATO. So Russian hackers launched a propaganda campaign against him, stoking protests in the pro-Russia eastern part of the country. He then sent in disguised Russian troops, and before long, violence erupts. In goes the Russian military, and in early 2014, Putin annexes Crimea. He continues to support the fighting in Ukraine, and as of 2017, over 9,000 people have died. The world erupts in protests, but Putin doesn't give in. See, his aggressive foreign policy successfully weakens his neighbors while also rallying Russians around him. But he has done all of this at the expense of his own people. His invasions have prompted harsh sanctions from the West, barring Russian businesses from trading in Western markets. Russian currency has plummeted in value, and the energy industry that Russia relies on is collapsing. It's hard to imagine Russia can continue under these circumstances. But the election of Donald Trump brings new hope for the Putin vision. Trump's rhetoric has been notably soft on Russia. He could lift sanctions and weaken NATO, potentially freeing up space for Putin's Russia to become a dominant power once again.
Поэтому за победу Дональда Трампа, за новую внутреннюю политику в США, и за внешнюю политику, и за быстрее улучшить отношения между Россией и Соединенными Штатами Америки. Это исторический момент, потому что этого не было 71 год. За Дональда Трампа, за его победу, что было все хорошо в Америке. И по русскому обычаю после первой не закусывали. Давайте по второй.
You and the Russian government did never try to influence the outcome of the US presidential election, and there will be no evidence found.
Should they read my lips?
No.
Robert Mueller charged 12 Russian military officers with a sustained, wide-ranging cyber attack.
Comment on the Russian sanctions, Mr. President?
What are you going to do about, do you think Putin was behind this, Mr. President?
As the discussion in this House on Monday made clear, it is essential that we now come together with our allies to defend our security, to stand up for our values, and to send a clear message to those who would seek to undermine them. This morning I chaired a further meeting of the National Security Council, where we agreed immediate actions to dismantle the Russian espionage network in the UK, urgent work to develop new powers to tackle all forms of hostile state activity, and to ensure that those seeking to carry out such activity cannot enter the UK, and additional steps to suspend all planned high-level contacts between the United Kingdom and the Russian Federation. Let me start with the immediate actions. Mr. Speaker, the House will recall that following the murder of Mr. Litvinenko, the UK expelled 4 diplomats. Under the Vienna Convention, the United Kingdom will now expel 23 Russian diplomats who have been identified as undeclared intelligence officers. They have just 1 week to leave. This will be the single biggest expulsion for over 30 years, and it reflects the fact that this is not the first time that the Russian state has acted against our country. Through these expulsions, we will fundamentally degrade Russian intelligence capability in the UK for years to come. And if they seek to rebuild it, we will prevent them from doing so.
Day 546 of the Trump administration, and at the height over Helsinki, Donald Trump has invited Vladimir Putin to Washington this fall. As the New York Times and others have been saying, Trump long ago became the first American president even suspected of having any kind of loyalties or obligations to the leader of a foreign power, in this case a full-on adversary who hacked our presidential election. And now the president has apparently doubled down. He apparently had his White House aide for national security extend the invitation to Putin. It was not shared with those at the top of his administration. As all of this unfolds, Microsoft has discovered new attempts at election hacking, similar to what took place in 2016, directed at 3 unnamed candidates running in the midterms. And the Wall Street Journal is reporting 3 of the FBI's highest-ranking cybersecurity officials are stepping down from their posts. One official says other experts are expected to leave soon.
Russia now accused by the Department of Homeland Security of meddling and attempting to sabotage our power grid, our water supply, our airports,